Hello, welcome to this week's vlog. I read this many books and let's take a look at what I read. So this week I read The Weather Woman. This was an audiobook and I've given this 3.5 stars. The biggest issue for me was the pacing. This book was so long. I have found there are so many books that are just way too long, and it affects the pacing, it affects the enjoyment, and it's so unnecessary. I don't understand why authors are dragging out books with information that isn't even pivotal to the plot. So that was my biggest gripe with this. There was also a love relationship that spanned a decade, only because both parties were too cowardly just to say, hey, I kind of fancy you. Do you want to hang out? So that was frustrating. There was also this sort of looming diabolical scheme happening, and at multiple points, multiple characters were like, maybe we should go and investigate this thing just to know if it's true or not so that we can be more prepared. And yet they didn't. They just kept putting it off until the last moment when they had to go and investigate because it was like about to negatively impact them. And then it turns out, I'm not going to spoil anything, but that was frustrating. It's if you've got something that's very pressing and that could ruin your life, wouldn't you want to investigate that immediately and put your mind to ease if it turns out to be false? Or if it's true, you can then start preparing for the inevitable and perhaps turn the tides in your favor. So that was very annoying. The book itself, I've just realized I forgot to tell you, is about a Russian girl who becomes orphaned and she has an affinity with weather. She's able to read the weather and predict it months in advance, but it's not a magical realism book in any other aspect. She's the only character in this that has this sort of magical ability. And she ends up finding a family with an automaton maker, a clockwork maker, and he creates this clockwork woman, and they put on a show, The Weather Woman, where she can predict the weather. They make money, her identity is kept safe. This book was also incredibly progressive considering it's based in historical time. So it felt way too modern and woke and progressive for a story set in those times where women were oppressed. But yeah, in this story, multiple women are just, bucking the system. And I'm like, okay, I'm not sure that would be the case. Also depictions of transgender and gay relationships. So there was an LGBTQIA element in this. I did give it 3.5 stars because I still found it enjoyable and it's a sweet tale, but it was very heavily negatively affected by the length and these other little aspects. And then I read The House of Lost Wives by Rebecca Hardy. So this is set in 1813 and a woman is betrothed to a man that her sister was formerly betrothed to. Her sister then dies while betrothed to this man. And when she goes there to marry him, she finds out he's got quite a few dead wives. So it's sort of like a mystery. The cover is really cute. It caught my attention. This was just so boring. I thought that the premise of finding out what happened to these 4 dead wives would be interesting. Alas, it was not. The love stories in this were not to my taste. The only character that I liked was Esme, the dead sister, and she was very briefly in it. So I wish I hadn't pushed through with this. I've given it 2.75 because it just, like I said, wasn't entertaining to me. It was boring. I didn't care for it. It's very, very, very forgettable. And that brings me on to the next book, which is Remarkably Bright Creatures by Shelby Van Pelt. This is about a cast of characters, all in their POVs, one of them being Marcellus the octopus. He was delightful. There's also Toba, an elderly cleaning lady who cleans the aquarium. I got halfway through this and I realized at best I'm probably going to give this a 3. I decided to DNF it. There were a lot of POVs I didn't care for, and when that's the case, I know that that's just going to ruin the overall book for me, especially Cameron. There was a character named Cameron who was a very immature young man, did not care for his bits. So for me, I had to DNF. I didn't want to give it a low rating because I think it's probably a great book for a lot of people, just it's not for me. Sorry that I'm sweating bullets over here. I'm just so hot right now. Hands are so hot right now. So I just read Anastasia. I've given this 3 stars. It's a very, very loose retelling of the Russian Tsars and Anastasia and Rasputin and that whole shebang, which is a fascinating tale because of the mystery of it. But in this world, people got magical powers, there's vampires, there's magic rocks, and it just goes wild. It just does anything and everything. This book is 500 pages. It did not need to be 500 pages. If it had been cut way down, it probably would have been a lot more entertaining, thrilling, amusing. However, you were just with Anastasia from when she's a child all the way through to her mid-20s. And yeah, it was just so unnecessarily long. The characters, yeah, I don't know how I feel about them. I didn't really love anyone. I did not like the romance, to be honest with you. Wasn't feeling it. There are illustrations in this book, and I use the word like illustrations lightly because the tits and ass were very accentuated, to the point that the illustrations felt more like hentai than illustrations in a book. There were a lot of, like, for instance, scenes of them naked and having sex. A lot of them. And normally I'd be like, yeah, this is great. But I don't know, in this book, I felt really male gazy, and I don't know, it just creeped me out a bit. And I was like, I can't believe I'm like saying no to illustrations of hot chicks. But anyway, the book just got real weird and it was all over the shop and I just didn't really feel it. And I'm like, why did I persevere? I don't know what's wrong with me lately, but I've been pushing through mediocre books. I guess I keep hoping maybe you'll get better, but this was 500 pages. I should have given up at least at 250 and gone, am I enjoying it? No, I'm not. Why am I continuing on? I don't know what's wrong with me. I really want to have less 3-star books. Do you know what I mean? I don't want to be rating anything less than 3 stars. And it's my own fault for pushing through when I really shouldn't be. But I don't know what's in it at the moment. I'm just persevering when I shouldn't be persevering. I should be throwing in the towel. But that was it, Anastasia. It wasn't for me. 3 stars at best. Let me tell you about the other books that I read this week. So I also read Men I Trust. This was a graphic novel. I gave this 1.5 stars. I really didn't like it. So the illustration style itself is really jarring. It's very distracting. You've got these very big block-like humans with these tiny little heads on top, and their hair color sometimes keeps changing, so you sort of struggle to know who's who. But yeah, just the way it was drawn was just weird, and it really took me out of it. So you have the main 2 characters, I've already forgotten their names, Sasha and something. And the main woman is a single mother and she works 2 jobs, one at a deli, one as a stand-up comic, and she's really struggling. So she's struggling with poverty and with her deadbeat baby daddy. And then you've got this other woman who's going through depression, and she goes to one of her comedy shows and she becomes a bit obsessed. So she approaches her after the show. The comic is like struggling to carry all her things in her sleeping child home. So the other woman offers to give her a hand, which, okay, fine. She goes on the way home with her though. There's a car that sort of drives close by, and the woman picks up a rock and throws it at the car and starts this like altercation with the driver. And the mom's like, you know what? I need to get home. My kid needs to go to bed. I don't want to deal with this. So they get to her house and they go inside, and the woman's putting her baby to sleep, and the other chick just hangs around and like makes herself a cup of tea, and the mum comes out and you can tell she's exhausted. The other woman's like not getting the hints and just like chatting and drinking and all this stuff. And then the woman's like, hey, I need to get to sleep, you know, thanks for helping me, but can you go? And the other chick's like, yeah, sure, I'm going to call a stalker chick from now on. I can't believe I forgot the names. Like I said, Sasha and something else. And she goes to kiss the mum. And mom's like, hey, excuse me, like, no. And right from this get-go, I got like bad vibes from the stalker chick, like stalker vibes. She's just sort of like pushing herself on the mum. Anyway, she'd asked the mum all these personal questions and the mum would ask them. And then the next day, stalker chick shows up at the deli and he's like, hey, I bought you some food. Come have lunch with me. And I was just like, ooh, I don't like it. She's like inserting herself into the mum's life and it's creepy. But anyway, so she keeps calling her and she keeps showing up, and then things like happen and the stalker puts the mum in a really dodgy, sketchy situation. Some stuff happens and then the book ends. I know it's like dealing with themes of like depression and poverty and everything else, but this was just a really upsetting story. You feel for the comic, the mum, because she just isn't going her way. All she wants is a friend, some sort of support, someone. And so I think that's why she sort of goes along with the stalker chick, even though like there's red flags everywhere. But then the stalker chick just keeps trying to push herself on her, and I'm just like, oh, I did not like it. So I did not like the story. I did not like all the rest of the characters. Sorry guys, I'm always scratching my nose because there's cat hair just always on my face. And yeah, I did not like the illustration style. Like, I really did not like this book, and I don't even know what the title has to do with the story. So 1.5 stars. Then I read Mysteries of Thorn Manor, which is like a little novella, and it's sort of obviously in between the first book and the second book in this series. I loved the first book, loved it. This second novella, I'm not rating it because it's so short. It really just is this sort of like one event that happens, and it's super cute, and I like the characters, so I thought it was sweet. Was it necessary? Probably not, but I'm guessing you have to know what happens in this for the second book, because if they don't mention that, you'll be like, what happened? But that's not how the first one ended, so it is kind of necessary to know what's going on. But I did enjoy it. It's characters I love, so it was fine. And then I read This Vicious Grace, and I gave this 3 stars. So this is about a world, I think it's based in Italy, and these 2 gods, Crollo and Dea. Crollo sends demons and shit. Dea chooses chosen ones, humans, to fight. And like each little island has their own chosen one called the Fenestra, and she has to find her Fonti to amplify the powers. So there's a few people that are born with like different powers. Maybe they can do fire, wind, all that sort of thing. And then you got the Fenestra, and she's like the amplifier. But once she becomes a Fenestra, she can't touch anybody else because she sort of like kills them. And in this case, this Fenestra is killing everybody. She's killed 3 of these Fonties, and everyone's starting to think maybe she's like not going to be our savior, and people start trying to straight up murder her. So she goes and hires this dodgy dude to be her bodyguard, and you can like guess, you know, sort of what happens. It was predictable for me. So that's why I gave it 3 stars. It was very average. It took forever to get into it. So this is all talk and very little action about this big impending, you know, fight with these demons or whatever that Crollo sends. And yet the fight itself lasted like a couple of pages. So the most of the book is just planning and chatting. Like I said, I gave it 3 stars because it's fine, but it's just, yeah, it's nothing great, guys. It's very much, you could miss it. And then I read this book, I've forgotten what it's called. It's the second in the series. I love the first one, and this one I DNF'd halfway through. It's very rare for me to love a first book and then really not like the second. But in this case, that was the case. It just felt really basic and boring, and I didn't care about any of the characters anymore. And I just didn't care, and I was really shocked. I thought maybe I'll just push through to find out, but I was like, I don't actually care what happens, so I probably shouldn't push through. So I did DNF it, and yeah, that was a bit upsetting because I loved the first one, Long Live the Elf Queen, I think it was, and for some reason all the magic was gone with this one. So after so many mid books this week, so many mediocre, average, even way below average books, it was quite a run of crappy books. I was desperate to end the week on something good, and I thought, why not try a romance? You know, an enemies to lovers romance, and might do the job. So I picked up The Hating Game because it's meant to be, even though it's contemporary, enemies to lovers. And look, I only consider enemies to lovers fantasy books because they're legitimate enemies. They're from like warring factions, or one's a demon, or there's real enemies. In the real world, I don't really feel like people have enemies. You've got rivals, and that's what this was in this case. So in this book, got 2 people. They were both assistants to the CEOs of book publishing companies. These 2 separate book publishing companies merged, and so they both end up sitting at this desk like facing each other all day, and they don't like each other. Their separate book publishing companies had very different like ethos and principles and ways of being run that are sort of at odds with each other. And from day one, Josh, the dude, was very standoffish and rude to Lucy, and a bit of a dick, I'm gonna say. Like, he was way out of line, to be honest. Like, supposedly they keep reporting each other to HR, and with good reason. It's not a healthy environment, and I think at this point one of them would have been let go of because of the constant HR issues. But anyway, Lucy then decides to go on a date with somebody else, and that sort of changes Josh's demeanor and his tactic, and all of that, I guess, pent up frustration with their constant back and forth turns into sexual attraction. Look, it's a romance book. It's cheesy, it's predictable, but I enjoyed it. I ate it up, and I didn't mind their back and forth and their banter. I found myself quite similar to Lucy except I don't have a Smurf collection. Smurfs, guys, like one chick and a whole bunch of men just weirded me out even as a kid. But I did have some issues with it. So the sex scenes with all of this build up were very almost fade to black. So it wasn't really the smut I was hoping for. And the second thing is the constant mentioning of, say, Josh being so big, so muscly, big, muscly, tall, big man, muscly, strong, abs, 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 abs. And then in reverse for Luce, so small, so tiny, so teeny, little, mini, teeny, tiny Lucy. I just really don't like that in books. I don't need to constantly be reminded how big and muscly and abby the man is, and I don't want to be told constantly how small and teeny, tiny and fragile, petite the woman is. It's just something I don't enjoy, and this was constantly shoved down your throat. So that's the one thing I really didn't like. But otherwise, everything else was fine. I like the story. I like the way the relationship progressed. It does like pick up very quickly. Like very quickly you get into it. But it is slow burn because they take quite a while to actually have sex. I forgot to mention there's this scene where they're not even really lovers yet, and she gets violently ill. And he takes her home and he cleans up all the vomit, and every time like she's constantly just vomiting every so often, he goes in and he cleans her up and he puts her back into bed, and he gets a doctor to come over and check her out. And in between all that, all through the night, he's cleaning her house. And like, as a girly whose main love language is acts of service, like amazing. This guy isn't even her partner, and the way he just took care of her over a course of a few days, yeah, I was like, okay, this guy might be a keeper. That's the point where I forgave him for all of his previous assholeness. I'm like, there's people that I've been with that couldn't even clean up one bowl of vomit for me, let alone multiple, and change all my clothes and wipe my face and get a doctor and give me fluids and clean my home. Like, amazing. Yeah, it was still enjoyable. Thank God I decided to give it 4 stars because it was a fun read, and compared to all the other books I read this week, it was by far the standout. So those are all the books that I read this week. I'll just go and grab something. So for next week, I've actually got 2 library books that I need to read, so I may as well let you know what they are. I've got The Path to Kindness, Poems of Collection and Joy. So I've got this too, gorgeous cover, just caught my attention. And it's got those like beveled edges. I don't know what the word is for that. And then this came into the library, Alone with You in the Ether by Olivia Blake. And I've seen everybody raving about this. So I thought, okay, you're coming home with me. So those are 2 books that I will be reading next week. But that is everything for this week. I hope that wherever you are having a gorgeous morning, afternoon or evening. And as always, stay wild, Star Child.